Another flip video lesson. This lesson is for lesson 8.7 through 8.8. And the title of this flipped video is The House of Representatives and Counting Slaves. And as a fun little subtitle, I call this Battle Royale. Northern states versus southern states. And you will find out by the end of this video exactly why I call this a Battle Royale. Let's get started, shall we? As a reminder, these videos, these flipped lessons, are meant for educational purposes. So please make sure you pause the video and rewatch if you're not understanding something, especially if you're filling out the outline, which I encourage you to be doing, or if you don't know how to exactly answer one of the homework questions. All right, let's talk about some background issues or issue that was going on here. Now, the House of Representatives was based upon a state's population, which all of you, I think, understand from the previous video. However, there was a problem. How do you count slaves? Now, Southerners said that a slave was equal to one person or an actual citizen. That seems right. In our day and age, a slave is a person. What's wrong with that, Mr. Volkman? You may be asking yourself. Well, things were different in the late 1700s. Northerners, on the other hand, said no. Slaves were not equal to one citizen. They said that the Southerners viewed slaves the same as the North viewed cattle or horses. If that was the case, why should a slave be counted as one person in figuring out how many representatives should be sent to the House? The South didn't treat them like people. Why should they be counted like people? Governor Morris of Pennsylvania said that the South should make their slaves citizens and let them vote. If, of course, they wanted slaves to be counted as a whole person. Now, I want you to stop and think about this. This line of thinking is very different from our thinking in this day and age. Now, you may be thinking, well, the North is harsh. They don't want slaves to be counted as people. The South wants slaves to be counted as people. The South is way nicer. Well, the South had ulterior motives in wanting their slaves to be counted as a whole person. And the North had ulterior motives as well in saying that slaves should not be counted necessarily as a whole person. Let's get into that thinking, shall we? In figuring out how much taxes a state should pay, the federal government looked at the population of each state. The more people that lived in the state, the more taxes they paid. Really simple. More citizens, more taxes. Less citizens, less taxes. Now in the South, slaves were not thought of as citizens, nor even, as we'll learn later, as actual real human beings. They were viewed as farm equipment, for lack of a better word. However, the North realized the slaves were still people. So when counting the slaves for taxes, the South, through the federal government, said that slaves only counted as 3/5 of a person, which of course made the South really happy because they weren't paying as much tax. Now, you may be wondering, what does paying taxes have to do with figuring out how many representatives get sent to the House of Representatives? Hang in there with me here for a moment. Now, the northern states wanted this line of thinking when it came to figuring out how many people to send to the House of Representatives. Their thought was, southern states, if you're not going to view slaves as a whole person when figuring out how much tax to pay, you shouldn't view your slaves as a whole person when figuring out how many representatives you get to send to the House of Representatives. It's just not fair. Now, of course, the South wanted more representatives in the government. Because if that happened, they'd get more of a say in the laws and the taxes that the country had. And if they counted slaves as a whole person, they would get that. I want you to take a look at this chart right here. This right here, this column represents the total population of each state in 1790. The middle column is how many slaves each state had. This column is the percentage of those states. So if you look at a place like Maryland, 32% of their population was made up of slaves. Look at South Carolina, almost half of their population were slaves. If they didn't count slaves as their population, they would lose a ton of representatives. That meant they wouldn't hardly have any say in the government compared to other states in the Union. I'm going to blow this up here so you can see it better. I'd like you to pause the video here, and I want you to look at both charts because I want you to take a look at the populations of all the states. The states that are highlighted darker are the southern states that have slaves. This chart here shows just the amount of slaves in general each state had. And hopefully you'll get a view as to why the South wanted their slaves to be viewed as a whole person. So please pause the video, look at both charts. It's really important you understand that slaves made up a huge amount of population in these southern states. With these arguments going back and forth between the northern state delegates and the southern state delegates, things did not look good for the Constitutional Convention. It was at a standstill, headbutting quite a bit, or headbutting. Here's the battle royale part, guys. Huge disagreements between what's going to happen next. Here comes James Madison. Oh, he's flying in on a world-class airliner, skydiving, jumping down to save the Constitutional Convention. Ah! And his idea is this, that slaves in the Constitution would be called non-free. Kind of an interesting phrase, non-free. He didn't call them slaves, never mentioned the word slaves in the Constitution, by the way. Didn't call them people either, they're just non-free. Slaves would then be equal to 3/5 of a free citizen, of a person. There's that 3/5 again, just like the taxes. So if you do some math with that, 100 slaves would be the same as 60 free individuals. So that was a huge first part of the big compromisation. Some more things came into play too in this compromisation, as I call it. First off, Madison proposed that Congress would not be able to tax any imports. Besides, food and other things that are imported in to help industries, what else is imported into our country back then? Oh, I know, slaves. So slavery could not be taxed. Interesting. Also, the federal government could not interfere with the slave trade until 20 years had passed from the signing of the Constitution. That meant 1808 was the next time that the federal government or Congress could talk about the slave trade. Lastly, they put in something called the Fugitive Slave Clause. This was that runaways had to be returned back to their plantations no matter what. Didn't matter where they were found. If a slave ran away, they had to be brought back. And slave catchers made a lot of money off of doing this. I believe I read online that they would either receive either $60 or $100 per slave that they caught and returned. Without these compromises, guys, the southern states would not have signed the Constitution. Pure and simple. So I want you guys to be the judge right now. Were these compromises worth getting a new constitution and a new government? What do you think? This is going to be an extra credit question. I want you guys to think very carefully about this before you answer. Don't just jump to, no, it wasn't worth it, or yes, it was worth it. I want you to think very critically about this. Thank you guys for your patience and watching this slightly longer video than the previous ones. See you in class.